Hi, John Grenham again. More about researching our Irish ancestors. Today I'm going to be talking about military records, how you can use military records to identify your ancestors, where the records are, and so on and so forth. And once again, I'm going to be using my own site as the jumping off point. So let's get to the site. Okay, here we are at the current homepage. The guide to military records is deeply hidden inside the free browse section. Let me show you how to get at it. Under records, occupational, because being a soldier was definitely an occupation. You pick one, you pick a soldier down here, click submit, and you have, first of all, as is the way with lots of the site, there are these lists of sources. But what I'm going to be concentrating on is this. This is a guide to researching Irish soldiers. Now, most of this is from Tracing Our Irish Ancestors, the 5th edition, published in 2019, where there are various sort of short essays, overviews of the main occupational records. So this is on military records. There are a couple of things to be said about researching Irish soldiers. You can see the page I'm looking at is Researching Irishmen in the British Army. So the most important thing to remember is that before 1922, if an Irishman was a soldier, he could only be, and he was enlisted in Ireland, he could only be in the British Army. The army was the British Army. So you're talking about British Army records if you're talking about anybody pre-1922. I'd say a few words later on about post-1922, that the Irish Army, the army of the Free State and then the Republic of Ireland, and how you can go about getting records relating to those men. And again, we're talking about men, Irish men. Until well into this century, there were no women serving in the army. The third thing to keep in mind is that lots of Irishmen also served in the US Army, and there are lots and lots of US Army records. One of the statistics I've heard, which floored me when I heard it, is that actually more Irishmen served in the Union side of the army in the American Civil War than served in the British Army in the First World War. More than 200,000 men served. There were large recruiting campaigns. Campaigners came to Ireland and recruited men with all sorts of the usual promises of gold and adventure that tempted young men away. And they went and they fought, and they discovered it was a lot more sordid and painful than they were expecting. Lots of them stayed in the US. Lots of Irishmen who were already there enlisted. And I'm not going to say an awful lot more about it. Let me recommend two things to you. The first is the this Fold 3. Fold 3, which is an ancestry website, has military records, most of them relating to the US. It's a subscription site, but there's a particular category of records in here that are extraordinarily useful for family history, and those are the Civil War pensions records. In order to qualify for a pension, and again we'll say something about this when it comes to the Irish Army later on as well, in order to qualify for a military pension, all the bureaucracy involved was huge. People were interviewed, people had to produce documentary evidence of their origins, of when they were recruited, of their family, of how long they'd been in the US, where they lived, all sorts of wonderful items of family information, and they're there in the Civil War pensions applications, and they're not all of them have been digitized as yet, but most have. And if you have an Irishman or an Irish family in the US from the 1860s on, it's well worth checking this out. People were applying for widows' pensions even 20 and 30 years after the end of the Civil War, so it doesn't have to be somebody who was immediately there. And there were also, I mean, I've come across people in Ireland applying to the US for military pensions for example, a son who was killed in the Civil War, who was recruited, went over, fought, was killed, and his mother and father are now applying for a pension. So all sorts of wonderful things. It's worth keeping a good eye on Fold 3 for that. And a very good guide to it is this. This is a blog page run by a man called Damien Shields, who specialises in the Irish in the American Civil War, and he provides great guides to the pension records and to other records of the Irish on both sides, the Confederate and the Union side. And it's well worth, if you have any interest in it, if you have ancestors who were involved in it, he's worth checking out. The URL is IrishAmericanCivilWar.com. The man's name is Damien Shields. If you Google his name or Irish American Civil War, you'll get to that. Okay, to go back to where we were. The vast majority of men who served in the army served in the British Army. This was from the 18th century on. The bar on recruiting Catholics particularly was lifted in the 18th century, and it was the only route out of destitution and poverty for lots and lots and lots of Irish, and they grasped it with both hands, and they signed up en masse. And I've seen figures that say, but by the mid-19th century, something like 40% of the British Army, of this huge standing army, were actually Irish. Okay, and like the US Army, the British Army ran on bureaucracy. It counted people, it counted who it was paying, it counted deserters, it counted people getting married, it recorded movements around the place, all sorts of things. And all of those records, complex as they are and way beyond the scope of the kind of talk I'm giving now, but all of those records, with a couple of exceptions, are in the English National Archives in Kew in London. Okay, you can go to Kew, and they will. It's an absolute Aladdin's cave of records, but they have partnered with two particular commercial websites, findmypast.co.uk and ancestry.co.uk, to digitize lots of the service records particularly. The most useful records for the rank and file, which is what most people will be interested in, are the service records. And the service records generally relate to discharges and discharges to pension. The main institutions dealing with those were the Royal Hospital in Chelsea, in London, and the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham in Dublin. Although they're called hospitals, they had in-pensioners. They had some injured soldiers living, but most of what they did was administer the payment of pensions to out-pensioners. Probably 95% of the pensioners were not living on the site. This was the great granddaddy of all welfare systems. Why would a government be so generous? Well, I think bitter experience teaches most governments who have standing armies that once you discharge your soldiers, you don't want them standing around in large groups being very discontented. You make sure they get a pension and they go back to where they came from and they have their pension and they're happy. You keep your ex-soldiers happy. I think that still applies to most countries even today. All right, but pensions and discharges are the main sources of information. What the National Archives in London did with those documents was divide them between Ancestry and Find My Past. Initially the divide was quite clear. Anything post 1913 went to Ancestry, anything pre 1913 went to Find My Past. As is their wont, the two competing companies have sort of strayed into each other's territories. They've had little incursions and raids on each other's records, but that's still the best rule of thumb. If you're looking for the service records of an Irishman in the 19th century, Find My Past is the best place to look. If you're looking at First World War records, for example, Ancestry is the place to look. But there are all sorts of overlaps. I mean, one of the unfortunate things about the sites is that they're not eager to tell you what they don't have and what the other site has. So you end up, at least I end up, having to search both of them. Okay, and sometimes they don't know themselves what they have. The policy seems to have been hoover them up, digitize them, transcribe them, stick them on the site, move on. So that there are all sorts of bits and pieces in there. And if you think of it, a bureaucracy like the British Army that's been creating records for the best part of 350 years, there are all sorts of amazing, wonderful things. Deserters' records, officers' marriage records, description books giving physical descriptions of the men, all sorts of things. And what is and isn't there, I don't think even the National Archives knows exactly what is and isn't on each of these sites. Okay, to give you an example, this is a statement of service, part of a discharge to pension, a very early one. Let me just click on it and show it to you. And this is from Find My Past. It's a statement of service, so it gives, down at the bottom here, you can see the periods and where the service happened. This is because they have to calculate the period of service in order to determine the amount due. So, and the man here is James Keegan of Captain Humphrey's company. So an Irishman, James Keegan, a classic Midlands Longford name. There we are. Again, 1809. It's very early. You're not going to find any parish records from Longford recording the birth of James Keegan, the baptism of James Keegan. So very often the soldiers' records are the earliest and the most useful. A fair number of these records are actually on the National Archives' own site as downloadable microfilms. This is a wonderful shortcut that the English National Archives has created, where they simply feed their microfilms into a digitization machine, put the result online, and you have 300 megabytes that you can download of the microfilm. If you went into the archives, you'd be using the microfilms on a microfilm reader. Now you have to download them here, and you can see they've got all sorts of wonderful things. So Admiralty 104, service registers and registers of deaths and injuries. There are customs officers' records. There are officers in the Royal Marines. You can see there's all sorts of wonderful records there. That's one of these. Don't start looking at it at 8 o'clock in the evening, because you'll be there at 4 o'clock in the morning. It's a wonderful free service that they despite the commercialization that they've got entered into with Ancestry and Find My Past, they're still very committed to making these records publicly available. Okay, there are all sorts. If you want to go through the types of records, I'm not sure it's that useful to go into the details. It is a bit of a hit and miss what you're going to find, where you're going to find it. One of the errors that people fall into is the notion of Irish regiments. There were regiments in the British Army that were specifically Irish. The Royal Dublin Fusiliers, the Munster Fusiliers, the Enniskillen Fusiliers, and the problem is that there were lots and lots of Irishmen in other regiments as well, and there were lots of non-Irish in those regiments. So the regiments may have had their home bases in Ireland, but they were not necessarily only Irishmen. There is a very good guide to the to Irish regiments in the British Army. It's on the website of the Irish Military Archives. Let me just show you. Why is this in the Irish Military Archives, or it was? It was on the Irish Military Archives because they were pestered with people coming to them asking about British Army regiments. So what they've done is put together this document. It's linked to from the site, showing the Connaught Rangers, all the various Irish regiments, and it gives you all sorts of detail about where the regiment were based, where the records are now, how you can get access to them, if there is a regimental history association, addresses and so on and so forth. So that it's very useful. It's enlightened self-interest, the fact that it was put together, and it's linked to there on the from the from this section of the Irish Ancestors website. Okay, one thing I want to we just had a brief look at it there. This is findmypast.co.uk. One of the things to keep in mind is this is not findmypast.ie. This is not the Irish section of Find My Past. It's findmypast.co.uk. So even though, as I say, 40% of the soldiers in the mid-19th century were Irish, they are British records. So that the English being a bit funny about retaining control of their borders applies even to records. It applies even to retrospectively. So you'll only find the records of the Irish and the British Army on the .co.uk, the website. When you're searching on it, one of the things that is one of the most useful things you can have is a service number, and that's true not just of By My Past, but of Ancestry, of virtually any site that does research on British Army records. If you can search on a service number, you can see that you're given a box to enter it here. You're guaranteed the person you're looking at is the right one. More often than not, the most you'll have is the name of regiment. And the names of the regiments came and went, they amalgamated, they were renamed. The name, for example, the 3rd Battalion is the Royal Lancers. I'm not even sure if that's a real thing. How do you spell that if you're putting it into the regiment? Use your wildcards. This example that I've got here is somebody came to me looking for a James Brown who had served in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and this is how you search for it. The Dub, wildcards either side of Dub and Fuss, so that whether there's a Royal in the title or a non-Royal in the title, whatever battalion it is, that will find all of them, and an asterisk after Brown will find a Brown with an E at the end. You see the Browns with the E at the end here, and you have 22 results of James Browns who served in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and you have an indication of the birth years. So you have a discharge document from Chelsea. You have let's just have a look here. This man born in 1861. Let's have a look at that, and you can see this is what a Chelsea discharge document looked like. It's a duplicate of a short service attestation for James Brown, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, joined at Naas on the 6th of October 1882. His name, it gives you here, he was born in or near the town of, and here, this is where you want to save a copy of this. Go away, put on your goggles, have a cup of coffee, sit down and stare at it. What that actually says is Rosleagh. So that's Rosleigh in the town, the parish of Rosleigh, the town of Rosleigh in the county of Fermanagh. That's right in the very south of Fermanagh. It's normally spelt now Roslea. And this is his age in 1882, he's 21. So again, it's before the start of civil registration. You get an exact age, all sorts of wonderful things that you can use as threads to take you back to earlier records. Okay, as I say, Find My Past, Ancestry, preferably both. I've found things that weren't supposed to be on Ancestry that were supposed to be on Find My Past, and vice versa, and it's just a fact of life. Nearly everything I've been talking about has to do with enlisted men. Officers are a different kettle of fish altogether. First of all, because of their social class, they tend to be more conspicuous and easier to find in other records, and also a lot of their army records are very easy to find. The official army list was published from 1740, at least annually, and that lists every army, every officer, every commissioned officer in the army. There's a complete set of them on the national, downloadable as digital microfilm from the National Archives. also at thegenealogist.co.uk. And I'm not going to go into too much detail. Google researching British Army officers, and you will be up to your eyeballs in advice. The Irish Army is also worth saying something about. The Irish Army only came into official existence in 1922. Before then, the only official army on the island of Ireland was the British Army. What happened after 1922 is that those who had fought between 1916 and 1921 in the guerrilla campaign, the rebellion, the War of Independence, as it's called, were treated as if they had been army officers, or members of the army, sorry, not enlisted men or officers, and they were recorded in military service and pension and medal applications. So like as we saw with Fold 3 with the US Civil War pensions applications, the pension applications for those who served in before up to 1922 were extraordinarily detailed. Again, they needed references, they needed commanding officers, descriptions of their engagements. They needed to give exact details of where they had been at what point during the conflict, and their pension was calculated on the basis of how many days they were deemed to have served. So it could be extraordinarily bureaucratic, and produced wonderful interviews, long letters of people describing exactly where they served, who they served with, what happened to them, and so on. So as you can see, the applications can run up to 400 pages. This is family history with bells on. So if you have somebody who they may not necessarily have fought, but if they applied for a pension, I hope you understand the distinction there. If they applied for a pension, not all of the pensions are online at military archives yet, but most of them are. They will all be in the end, and it's a wonderful resource. As well as that, the Bureau of Military History, which is also part of the military archives here, is an extraordinary record, an oral history of those who participated in the struggle between 1913 and 1921. Mostly interviews, transcribed interviews. Again, it happened. It was done in the 1940s as people realised that the veterans of the struggle of the war were beginning to die out. So there was the Bureau of Military History set up to go and record their experiences, and they're all online now. And this is an extraordinary resource, straight from the horse's mouth for the period. There are also bits and pieces of other things around. There was a census taken in 1922 of the members of the Defence Force, and that's on at census.militaryarchives.ie here. Why would they do a census of the army? Things were pretty chaotic up to 1922. They weren't quite sure who was in the army, where they were from. So the census gives you their age, it tells you their next of kin, it tells you where they're from. Again, it's the 12th to the 13th of November 1922. If you have somebody or you're connected to somebody who was involved in the struggle, it's a very useful jumping off point. Once you get beyond the War of Independence, when you get into the regular Irish Army, as it were, after that, things get a little stickier. Records are only available to next of kin. Okay, the records, more than people who left the Defence Forces more than 30 years ago, the records are held at the military archives, but you have to write to them, and you have to get evidence of a direct family connection. One of the good best resources about the Irish Army is this website, curra.info. Curra is the area in County Kildare where the main barracks, the main centre of military activity was, both before independence and after it. So it's a large part of the history of the area, and it contains a lot of information you won't find elsewhere, including lists of Irish Army officers and soldiers living in the barracks there up to the 1980s. So I'm not sure the military archives know that they're online, but they're there, Shh, don't tell them I told you. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I think I've given you enough um, to set the grey cells in motion, and I wish you luck and happy hunting. Bye.